Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Unfiltered with Sid. I'm your host, Sid Verma, and to start this video off, I wanted to address that I have had a habit of becoming completely obsessed with these random topics. If you look back a few months ago, it was attention spans and technology. If you look back last summer, it was free speech. And for whatever reason, the rabbit hole I've fallen down now is the founding of America, which admittedly is quite a niche hobby, summer hobby for a 15-year-old. I know that patriotic season is over. It's 10 days past the 4th of July as I'm recording this. The flags are all coming down. Everyone's done bursting their late fireworks. Everyone's kind of just moved on, which honestly kind of makes this the perfect time to talk about America's founding because once all that politics and symbolism has just faded away, you're left with the real raw history. I've spent the last couple of weeks just completely obsessed with it, right? We'd grown up learning about the founding of America, right? We know the big names. George Washington, our first president. Thomas Jefferson drafted up the Declaration of Independence. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, right? The big events, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. But if you asked me like a month ago why the Constitution looks the way it does, or why the founders thought that a republic could actually work when almost every successful country on earth was ruled by a king, I couldn't give you a straight answer. So naturally, I just started reading. I read the Federalist Papers, so I started reading Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention, and I read letters between the founders. And somewhere along the way, I realized that I had been looking at the founding of America completely backwards, right? We tend to think of the Constitution as this instruction manual, like the stuff you get when you buy something from IKEA, the instruction manual to build that. We tend to think of the Constitution as this perfect instruction manual for building a good government. But that's not really what it's about, right? It's a response to a much bigger question. How do you build a government for free people when history keeps suggesting that freedom doesn't last, right? And once I started thinking about that question, the whole story became much more fascinating, right? I think one of the hardest things for us today is appreciating just how strange America actually was because right now, democracy feels normal, elections feel normal, voting feels normal. In Michigan, we have our primaries due by like early August, right? So that voting process to elect our new leaders, it feels normal. Freedom of speech feels normal. But in 1776, none of that was normal, right? If you looked around the world, Britain had a king, France had a king, Spain had a king. Russia was ruled by Catherine the Great, who was an empress. The Ottoman Empire had a sultan. The Qing dynasty ruled China. So almost every successful government on earth had their power concentrated in one person or one family in a monarchy, right? And that wasn't considered oppressive by any stretch of the imagination back in the day. That's just how civilization ended up working out. And there was a reason people believed it had to work that way, right? Because history wasn't encouraging this whole idea of a republic. If you studied the ancient world, you'd read about the Roman Republic, right? There was elections, it had the Senate, it had checks on power. And then over time, that collapsed into the Roman Empire. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Caesar Augustus became the emperor. That republic disappeared, right? Or you could take England as a good example. They fought a civil war. They executed their own king. And for a brief moment, it looked like they were going to create something new. And then Oliver Cromwell, he accumulated all this power, and eventually that monarchy returned anyway. So it seemed that history kept repeating that same lesson that republics don't last. People can't agree. People disagree, and conflict keeps on growing. And eventually someone promises order, and people hand over their freedom in exchange for stability. So imagine in 1776 and saying, actually, I think the people can govern themselves, right? You weren't seen as an optimist. You just sounded unrealistic, right? You sounded kind of dangerous, right? And that's what makes the founding of America just so remarkable, right? Because they weren't just declaring independence. They were challenging 2 millennia of political history. So what actually happened? We reduce the American Revolution to a couple of words, right? No taxation without representation. The Boston Tea Party, the Declaration of Independence. Revolution, that's the version most of us end up learning. And I think that version actually misses the most important part, right? Because the revolution didn't begin with muskets. It didn't begin with Paul Revere riding out and warning everyone that the redcoats are coming. It began with ideas. By the time Thomas Jefferson sat down to write the Declaration of Independence, people had been arguing about that sort of political philosophy for decades, right? Think of Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke. They had started asking questions that at the time felt dangerous, right? Where does government actually get its authority? Does a king rule because God chose that king or because the people agreed to let that king rule, right? So Locke started to argue something radically different, right? He believed that every person is born with natural rights, life, liberty, and property. And governments don't create those rights. The point of a government is to protect those rights. And that's a small distinction, but it changes everything, because if a government exists to protect your rights, then what happens if that government starts violating them? So Locke had a simple answer to that. The people had the right to replace that government, right? And those ideas later crossed the Atlantic into our colonies. They spread throughout the colonies. So by the time Britain started imposing unfair taxes, tightening their grip on the colonies, and passing laws that the colonists saw as unfair, this fight became so much more than taxes, right? It was a debate about legitimacy. So it kind of revolved around this idea, like, does the parliament actually have the right to govern people who have no representation in it? And then if we look at Philadelphia, let's go to that hot summer of 1776. The Continental Congress is meeting, right? Outside, there's a war breaking out. Inside of Independence Hall, there's uncertainty, right? Despite how we think about it today, nobody knew whether that independence was going to work. Imagine being one of the representatives from the colonies in that room, right? You're not deciding whether to start a country that you know already that you know that country will already succeed. You're deciding whether you want to gamble everything on an idea that might get you executed, that the crown would kill you for, right? So Jefferson writes his first draft. Congress edits it. They argue over wording. They remove entire sections. Jefferson was frustrated by some of these edits, right? Which I like that part about it, right? Because it reminds you that these people aren't mythical heroes. They disagreed. They had a compromise. They were irritated. They were annoyed by each other. They were all human. And then they signed it. And I think we've become so familiar with the Declaration that we've forgotten how radical this one sentence really was. And this sentence sticks out to me, right? It goes, governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Today, that sounds obvious, right? But back then, that's a revolutionary concept, right? It rejected that idea of a divine right. It said governments exist because people allow them to exist, not because not because someone can inherit power from a monarchy, not because God can appoint them, but because the ordinary people consented, right? And that's such an extraordinary way of thinking in 1776. And they knew what they were risking, right? They pledged their lives. They were risking their fortunes, their sacred honor, right? And if Britain won, many of them would have been killed. And here's the part that kind of surprised me, because if you look at it, winning the revolution wasn't really the hard part. Building the country after the revolution was. Because it's easy to unite against one common enemy. It's another thing to agree on how you're supposed to govern yourselves after that enemy is gone. And the United States wasn't operating under the Constitution immediately. They were operating under the Articles of Confederation. And that was just a mess in its own right? The founders had spent so much time worrying about creating another king that they created a government that was too weak to function, right? Congress couldn't collect taxes. It couldn't enforce many of its own decisions, right? There wasn't a strong leader to carry out national policy, right? States acted like their own countries. Some printed their own money. They argued over trade. They ignored Congress when it was convenient. And sure, America won its independence, right? But it wasn't obvious that America would survive too long after that independence. And then came something called Shays' Rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion essentially was a group of farmers in Massachusetts. Many of them were veterans from the Revolution, actually. They rose up over debt and economic hardship. And the founders, our founding fathers, had to confront an uncomfortable truth, right? Because freedom by itself, it isn't enough. A government has to be capable of governing, right? So Washington saw this all unfold, and he became worried that everything that they fought for was just slipping away, right? Imagine risking your life to win independence only to watch your brand new country just completely crumble. And that's what they walked into in 1787, right? And this is kind of my favorite part of the entire story, the Constitutional Convention, because we imagine it as this calm gathering of brilliant men who all agreed with each other, right? But it was messy. Philadelphia was sweltering that summer again. Inside that room sat people who would later become legends, right? Because they didn't feel like legends then. Madison was just there quietly taking notes. Franklin was, I think Benjamin Franklin was 81 years old and he needed help walking. Hamilton had these great ideas and he wasn't scared about sharing his ideas. Washington stayed kind of quiet. He was just presiding over this convention with like a quiet authority because he was well respected. They argued just constantly, right? Larger states wanted representation based off population. Small states thought that would make them swallowed whole, right? And northern and southern delegates clashed over slavery. And that is a massive contradiction that would haunt the nation for generations, right? Some delegates wanted a strong executive leader. Others didn't want to accidentally create a king, right? There were moments when it looked like this whole constitutional convention was going to collapse, right? Washington himself, he privately wondered whether they were going to succeed, right? And that's something I never really appreciated until I read about it, right? Because we treat that constitution like it was something that was inevitable, right? It wasn't at all. It almost didn't happen, right? But eventually, after months of debate, compromise, frustration, and like bruised egos, they produced something new, right? They didn't produce a monarchy. They didn't produce a dictatorship. They produced a constitutional republic. And what fascinates me isn't just what they built, it's why they built it that way, right? This was probably the biggest thing I took away from the Federalist Papers. I used to think that the Constitution was written for good people, but someone like James Madison didn't think so. If you look at Federalist Paper number 51, James Madison, he wrote one of the most famous lines in political philosophy. I think it goes, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." So just think about that. He's just saying the reason why government exists is because people aren't perfect. We have ambition. We compete. We strive. We disagree. We seek power. So instead of pretending that human nature would change, that people would become angels, Madison helped build a system that assumed that it wouldn't. And there's another famous line which goes, "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition." And I personally love that sentence because it's so realistic, right? Madison isn't asking politicians to become saints. He isn't saying they're going to want your power. They're going to want power anyway, so let's make them check each other. That's why we have those three branches, the legislative, judicial, and executive. That's why we have Congress split into a bicameral legislature. That's why the states keep certain powers. That's why the Constitution isn't built on trust. If you think about it, it's built on competition, really. It's built on an equilibrium, right? Everyone wants something, and because everyone wants something, nobody can get anything. And I never realized how brilliant that was until I started reading it for myself. And then after all that, Washington made a very important decision, one of the most important decisions of his life. He just left office, right? He left office after 2 terms. He just stepped down, went home to Mount Vernon. Today that sounds, two terms. That's the maximum that you can serve, right? You can't serve more than 2 terms. But at that time, it was astonishing, right? History was filled with military leaders who refused to give up their power, right? Caesar didn't give up his power. Later on, Napoleon would not give up his power. Washington, he could have stayed in office. Americans would have liked him. They would have supported him. But instead, he wanted to prove that in this new republic, the office mattered more than the man. Ooh, That's and I wonder if that single act did as much to secure American democracy as anything that came out of the Constitution. Because reading about the founding of America didn't make me think that America's perfect. Far from it. Or the founding was perfect. No, it isn't. It wasn't. The founders, they were brilliant men in many ways. They were heavily flawed. They made compromises, especially on a topic like slavery, right? Which had devastating consequences and would eventually lead to the American Civil War. Ignoring that would be dishonest, though, but I also think it's possible to recognize something extraordinary without pretending it was perfect, right? What happened in those two summers in 1776 and 1787 was part of one of the boldest political experiments in human history. A group of ordinary and extraordinary men tried something the world had never seen before. They built a republic not because they believed men were angels, but because they knew that they couldn't be and they wouldn't be. And somehow, against all odds, that system has endured for 2.5 centuries. The Constitution is a blueprint for good people. It's a restraint on the bad ones. And I think understanding that changed the way I look at America and the founding of America and the hardships that our founding fathers had to endure. Anyways, those are just some thoughts that I've had spending way too much time reading about all this. If you enjoyed the video, let me know. There are so many more moments from American history that I love to dive into, political philosophy too. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next episode.